Hello and welcome to Aston Originals, where today we're discussing celebrity diets and some of the history around fad foods. You can follow us on Twitter at Aston Originals and subscribe on YouTube as well for the latest Aston University digital news content. So today I'm joined by Dr. James Brown and Dr. Duane Mellor. Good morning. So we're going to be discussing your recent article that was published on The Conversation. So please do go and check that out later. There'll be a link to it on the screen. We thought with all the New Year's resolutions and attempt to get healthier, it was well worth discussing this article. So firstly, can you both introduce yourselves?
So I'm Duane Mellor. I teach in the medical school. I also lead there on nutrition and evidence-based medicine within the medical school at Aston, and also happen to be a registered dietitian and a registered nutritionist.
And I'm Dr. James Brown. I'm an associate professor in biomedical science, and I'm the associate dean for external engagement for the College of Health and Life Sciences at Aston University.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for joining us. Well, throughout history, diets have come and gone. Celebrity diets are very popular. They're often bizarre, but they're not a new thing. So can you tell us more about that, James?
It's a really good question. Depending on how you define celebrity diets have been around for a very long time. So if you go back to 450 BC and the Daniel fast, which comes from the book of Daniel, this is probably the earliest example of what you might call a celebrity diet. And in this situation, Daniel asked his men if they were as strong as the Babylonians after a couple of weeks of just eating vegetables. So by restricting their diet and changing how they ate and their relationship with food, it was almost like the first trial of diets. So celebrity diets go back a very, very long way. And if you look at more recently at I suppose what we would now define as being as a 20th century celebrity, they've been increasingly common and increasingly popular, and at times even unhealthy and particularly unhelpful. So during the 20th century, we saw the rise of some really weird and sometimes wonderful, sometimes not so wonderful diets. So there were things like ingesting tapeworms to try and lead to reduced calorie absorption, which is obviously particularly unpleasant. There were some celebrity diets where smoking cigarettes, particularly in the 1920s, was suggested because there is an appetite suppression from smoking. But obviously, as we now know, smoking is so unhealthy. This was a diet that really nobody should try. And then completely weirdly, there was the cotton ball diet. So this was developed by models as a way of reducing food intake by swallowing balls of cotton to fill the stomach up and to soak up some of those stomach juices that would help digest your food. Nowadays, most cotton balls aren't actually even cotton. They're bleached polyester fibers. So this is a really unhealthy and unhelpful way of approaching reducing your calorie intake. So there's a long history of celebrity diets. Some of them are physiologically relevant, may be useful, may work, and some of them have been really unhelpful and unhealthy.
Yeah, particularly the cotton balls. That sounds quite scary. Some of the diets that we know about that are quite popular are the fasting diets. Obviously, they link to some religious practices, and then meat-free diets as well. Can you tell us more about those ones, Duane?
And if you look at the fasting diets, there's different types of fast. James has already mentioned the historical one, the one from the Bible, the book of Daniel, which is be vegan essentially for a period of 2 weeks. And that's evolved over into what we call Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox Christians, who will have this vegan, low fat, so they use less oil and other things for the period of Lent and Advent. So that can be up to half a year. That's mapped over into a number of diets, which you see. We've heard of the 5-2 diet, which the researchers at the South Manchester hospitals have invested in women with high risk of breast cancer. And that's been shown to effectively help them manage their weight, but also has potential health benefits through reducing some of the hormones linked to risk of breast cancer, which are also the same hormones linked to risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, things like insulin and insulin resistance. What we do know about fasting, though, is there's a whole range of them, and it needs to be accompanied by a way of eating when you're not fasting that's reasonably balanced. And if you look at the 5-2 diets that they used in Manchester, it was 800 calories. So it wasn't a complete no food day. It was a very low intake, about a quarter of your normal food intake 2 days a week. Then you'd have a full normal eating, sort of eating to appetite the rest of the time, but within the limits of either what we call a Mediterranean type diet, which hopefully we can talk about later, or sort of as a modified one, so a little bit more protein than normal to try and have a healthy, filling diet. There are other sorts of fasting where we can have periods where we eat less during the day. So there's sort of like a 16-hour sort of fasting. So you only eat in an 8-hour window. So you only eat effectively in the working day. That may have less of a metabolic effect. There's some evidence from lab studies. In humans, it's less clear. But the main reason it works is behavioral. If you know you can't snack in the evening, you'll be less likely to have those what we call energy-dense foods, the crisps, the sweets, the chocolates, which are really high in calorie, but are nutrient poor. And we can focus on eating the nutrient-rich foods, the ones that are high in fiber, vitamins, proteins, and minerals the rest of the time. And if you look at the fasting, and James mentioned it, some of those diets are meat-free. So it could be abstinence from those foods. And we see that not just in, the sort of Book of Daniel and Greek Christians, but also see that in some Hindu castes and also in Buddhism. But also we see it in Seventh-day Adventists, where a number of those choose not to eat meat. And if you look at the Linda Loma Seventh-day Adventists, they have longer life expectancy. Some of the research suggests that could be to do with eating less meat, but it may be part of a healthier lifestyle. And one thing that we need to remember when people choose to change their diet, be that vegan, or it could even be a low carbohydrate diet, which has got more meat in it, so it's counterintuitive that way. It's thinking about what you eat and making deliberate choices about what you eat rather than just eating sort of what's in the cupboards. So conscious eating, mindful eating can be an important part of any of these diets.
And just going back to the meat-free diets, I mean, they're quite popular at the moment. There's a lot of talk about veganism. Where do you think these originate from, James?
Again, it's a really good point. It's veganuary, as I'm sure you're all aware. If you're popping out to the supermarket nowadays, you'll see that all the major supermarkets extend their product of meat-free food during January. And there's been significant rises in the availability of processed meat-free food. Whether that's healthy or not is really still yet to be discovered. But if you look at the history of meat-free diets, obviously in some cultures it's a very long established history, but in the Western world, really it started in around the 19th century. And one name at least you'll be very familiar with, and that's William Kellogg, who's very famous for Kellogg's cereals, but also, and I hate this pronunciation because it's American, but Sylvester Graham, who made graham crackers, or graham crackers as they're called in America, developed these meat-free diets, which were again related to their spiritual beliefs, because they were very simple and pious diets, which were thought to at the time improve the body, mind, and spirit. So there is a history to veganism being popular in Western societies. In this century, a lot of the food choices people make around animal products are about their beliefs about the treatment of animals rather, and about wanting to avoid animal cruelty. And that is obviously something that's I think is a good thing. At the same time, there are health benefits often associated with vegan diets because of the reduced consumption of energy-dense foods, the increased consumption of nutrient-rich foods. So there's a history to meat-free diets, and the increase that we're seeing now, and the foods that we're seeing being made more available, is probably a good thing. Although a lot of those processed so-called fake meats that you'll see, there's not a lot of evidence about whether they're good for us or bad for us. So it's been going on for quite a while, this rise in veganism, and particularly in the Western world since the 19th century.
And just delving a bit further into the history of some of these diets, I always find, the historical context really fascinating. Can you possibly tell us more about the first diet doctors, James?
Yeah, so nowadays, obviously, if you look on Instagram, you'll see lots of people who probably aren't qualified to be offering advice on nutrition and eating behaviors. And obviously, registered dietitians like Duane are the experts in this field, but diet doctors really became a thing in the 18th century. The first well-known or well-described diet doctor was George Chain, who himself was particularly overweight. It was reported that at one point in his life he weighed 220 kilograms, which is twice my weight, and believe me, I'm not a particularly small person. And at that time in the 18th century, wealthy Georgian households would have had a lot of meals during the day, would have had a very high calorie diet, would have consumed a significant amount of alcohol, particularly during the evenings, and this would have contributed in those wealthy households to excess body fat being built up. And George Chain, this first diet doctor, got to a point where his health started to suffer and decided he wanted to change his diet to something that would help him. And he developed something called the vegetable and milk diet, which effectively had significantly fewer calories than the standard, certainly wealthy Georgian diet at the time. And it included drinking milk and tea and coffee, having bread and butter, some cheeses, fruits and nuts, and eating vegetables, particularly tender roots. He did also drink no alcohol, barring the occasional small glass of cider. So there is, since the 18th century, a history of diet doctors where advice and books were written and taken from these individuals as being, if you like, experts in the field.
That's certainly fascinating. So just moving on to Mediterranean diets. You mentioned that in the article, and I think it's a sort of diet that we're all very familiar with. We all think of it as a diet that's quite healthy. Can you explain why it's so well thought of, Duane?
It's probably well thought of, but a lot of people probably don't understand what we actually mean by Mediterranean diet. If we actually look at what it was and the ones we've studied, Mediterranean is a whole basin. So it goes from Spain all the way through bits of France, Italy, Greece. We forget the Middle East and North Africa. They're also Mediterranean. Where most of the research comes from are Sardinia and around Greece, and particularly some of the islands, including Crete. And in the 1950s and 60s, it was looked at what the traditional diets were consumed, particularly of Cretan villages in rural Crete, where they had lower incidence of heart disease. So they lived longer and were healthier for longer. And when we looked at their diet, and this is the things that people associate with the Mediterranean diet, olive oil. There are lots of vegetables, fruit, seeds, nuts, whole grains, with small amounts of meat, fish, because they are living on an island, and a little bit of wine. And that's what we call the Mediterranean diet. But if we backtrack a little bit, that was a food that was available. It was mainly fresh. They didn't have inputs of sort of manufactured food. And James has mentioned about sort of some of the vegan food being highly processed. We have an increased diet, and we see it in the Mediterranean even now. We have more and more processed foods. James also mentioned the simple diet that George Chen stumbled across in his work. It's that simplicity of these foods, and it's a simplicity of the culture within the Mediterranean diet, which is also important. And UNESCO actually recognize it as there's intangible cultural aspects of the diet, of knowing where it comes from, being attached to that food supply, and eating with others. That's also part of it. So we can have a Mediterranean type diet, but we might have slightly different vegetables if we have it in the UK. We might have slightly different nuts and seeds. You know, we might have less lentils and more peas because they grow here and it's part of our culture. And it's identifying with that culture of food rather than trying to eat a more simple diet and enjoying that simple diet with other people. And I think that's the Mediterranean diet we need to focus on. Unfortunately, when a lot of people think about the Mediterranean diet, it's when they go on holiday and have the gyros and the chips and sort of the lagers that go with it. That's not a Mediterranean diet. That came in hundreds of years later. And again, we're talking about history. You know, a lot of those meats and things came in as places like Greece were taken over and occupied by the Ottomans, and that altered their culture. So we need to remember a Mediterranean diet first is a simple diet based on these nutrient-rich vegetables and fruits.
I'll certainly bear that in mind. Thank you. Now, just to wrap this up, what top tips do you have for diets? What kind of diet should we be approaching or thinking of doing?
I think the first one, I'll let James come in after this one. I'll open that though. We need to remember what the word diet means. It means a usual way of eating. Too often in January, people say, I'm going on a diet, and it's restriction. January is the wrong time of year to go on a diet. We've talked about sort of culture of fasting. They happen before Christmas, not after Christmas. It's not in our culture. It's not a normal thing to do. And also, if you're looking at sort of going on a vegan or a plant-based diet in January, that's when the least plants are available. So reattach our word, an own diet, as a normal way of living, something we can enjoy long-term. And then sort of don't necessarily go for the vegan type trials in January. Do it when there's more fresh stuff available that you can really enjoy. I'll let James come in and I might throw a few more tips in afterwards, if that's okay.
I think that's really sound advice. I would just add to that by saying don't use diet as a verb. And what that means is, as Duane said, don't go on a diet. Think about your diet as a long-term relationship with food. Now, what we know from lots of studies looking at the different ways of trying to maintain a healthy body weight or to lose weight, which is also important, is that there is no one best type of diet, if we consider diet as a verb, and that actually across the various different types of looking at calorie intake, looking at feeding periods like fasting, looking at low carb or low fat, is that generally across a population, they're all about effective as each other. And what that means is that for some people, certain dietary interventions will work better than for others. So if you do want to lose weight and change your diet, pick something that you can adhere to. So if you really cannot go without food for a fast, or even cope on 500 or 800 calories a day, it's unlikely that a fasting diet will work for you. If you absolutely adore carbohydrates and by restricting them in a low carb diet, you're affecting your quality of life and you're not enjoying your food, again, you're unlikely to stick to that eating pattern. So if you do want to lose weight or maintain a healthy weight, it really is about having a long-term healthy eating plan that you can stick to, which means there's absolutely nothing wrong with the occasional piece of cake. There's nothing wrong with enjoying food as part of your broader dietary pattern. Just avoid those faddish 2-week, 4-week restrictive and unadherable diets that are unlikely to cause long-term changes to your weight or health.
And I think I'll come back in there and remember, food is something we enjoy, something we can share with other people. And going back to the idea about Mediterranean ways of eating, sharing food with others, and that's a good way, going back to James' point, there's nothing wrong with a piece of cake, but a shared piece of cake is half a piece of cake, so you're still enjoying it, but also you're bringing a smile to someone else's face, and that's important. And basing the diet on lots of the vegetables, the fruits, the nuts, the seeds, the pulses, the lentils, beans, whatever you want to call them, and going for less of the highly processed foods, the foods that are high in fat, sugar, and salt, which don't have as many of the other nutrients in. And remember, enjoy food and use food to help bring a smile to your face and the face of others.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time. And I will be going down for a piece of cake in a minute. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.